to the Interaction Sciences webinar, Maximizing Telco Offers. We have Jay van Sale and Estian Crous on the line with us today. They're going to be chatting about customer behavior, predicting needs, and delivering personalized recommendations in real time. Without further ado, let me over to Jay and Estian.
Thanks, Rob. So maybe I'll just do a brief introduction into Estian and give you a glimpse of what we're going to be talking about today. I met Estian some years ago and spent many nights working till late, early mornings, launching products, testing markets, trying out all kinds of different things, and learned during that process that you often hear the language, there are rock stars in the industry, and this is the guy that's a rock star. That's one thing that I've realized over time. So, worked in different parts of the world and is deeply interested in the analytic, the detail, gets truly excited about not just the mathematical part and the analytics, but also the coding and everything else that goes with that. So I've been really fortunate to work with you. So really welcome today to our session.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks for the intro. No pressure. And I still look back fondly on those early mornings. It was, as they say, the best of times and the worst of times, but exciting, very exciting.
Sometimes things break, sometimes they work, and then middle of the night, Jay, there's a coding that broke. What's working? What do we do? That comes to the territory, I guess. So the topic today is about an intersecting world of interaction sciences and the way in which we see the human and the interface with human into technology, and how that understanding of our interaction or the interactions can be used in business. And the other part of it is that there are in various industries so many different ways in which you can solve, recommend the problems, or nudging or messaging, whatever it might be. I mean, spend a number of years in solving some of these problems, including theorizing through some of the philosophical challenges that exist in this concept of interacting with humans. Maybe through the conversation, we'll keep it loose. Maybe just for the audience, going to try and deal with a number of different technical topics along the journey, but start off with this understanding why we need to talk about this, and then hopefully at the end, trying to unpack some of the reasons why this is really important to consider. So maybe as just a question on the outset, I mean, listen, what is your kind of philosophical view on how telecommunications or high frequency interactions or companies that sell products at such a different range of values? Because you can sell a 10 Rand service, or you could sell a 30 grand, what is it, a dollar device, all in the same setting. It complicates the way that you deal with humans.
Yeah, exactly. I think like when your options are so varied, it becomes very difficult when you talk about personalization and making recommendations that are valuable and useful to your customer. When you have so many options, that becomes a difficult thing to do sometimes, which is why talking about interactions, I think it's such a powerful framework to influence that. I think in a perfect world, if we could sit down with each of our customers and ask them, what do you like about our services, or what do you use it for? Why do you need it? What are your pain points? How can I better service you? If we could do that with every single customer, that would be ideal, but obviously we can't. And I think looking at interactions and how people engage with you gives you a powerful framework to infer a lot of that information and really use it to tailor and personalize what you do to make sure that every interaction you have with your customer is a useful and a valuable one from their perspective.
Yeah. So do you think that the philosophy around people coming to you or you going to them affects how you think about this? Because I often think that in interaction science, you need to consider, if you consider the human in the system, and it is your tech to that human, or it is the client's tech to your human, or it is your human to that human, there are so many different varied interacting points coming in and out. I mean, it's a lot of considerations in that.
Yeah, 100%. I think a lot of what happens in that space boils down to context, and that's what you're trying to capture. And those interactions being an inbound one where they're interacting with your app or your channel, whatever that is, or vice versa. It changes the context and it changes the nature of things, and it's very nuanced in each of those cases. It's an important distinction to take into account. There's all sorts of other things as well, like when you're talking to someone, you're competing for their interest and their time, and you need to make sure you do it right, or otherwise it cannot just cost you that one interaction, but everything down the line. Versus them engaging with you, it's more of an inbound situation. It's, yes, I have them, but they are there for a specific reason. Can I preempt that reason? Can I offer them something that speaks to that reason to make that interaction memorable?
But then, I mean, listen, we've debated this so many times, and I think that we've shared many other philosophical frameworks and theories, and we often talk about the sentimental equilibrium, and we speak about progressive exposure and systematic desensitization, and there are just like a plethora of different behavioral science constructs that can be applied in so many different ways. And the translation of this abstract phenomena into something physical is often the challenge sometimes. So maybe you want to give us a glimpse of a reasoning that you shared with me some years ago around if somebody checks their balance, as an example, and you know that you've captured their attention. I mean, what is the thinking around how you would think about or reason about and then create something that you can recommend something to that person? Why would you want to do that? And what is the impact?
Yeah, so I think using that example, someone checking their balance is an action, but it's that action is driven by a specific need. Most of the time, someone is checking their balance maybe because they want to download a video and they're checking if they have sufficient balance left to do that, or they just had a call that dropped and they want to check if the airtime has run out. There's various mechanisms that lead to that action of checking their balance. You can show them their balance, and that might require a fraction of that need, or you can say in the interest of personalization and making every interaction with your customer account, take it one step further and can we preempt what was driving that action and surface then intervention that is useful to catering for whatever that need was that led to that interaction. They might be checking it because of the video download, so why not, when they are in that space, offer them a data bundle that allows them to download that video, and you've went from them just checking their balance to solving a problem and creating value for them, but also for the company. And that is where my interest lies. I think it is. I enjoy seeing the actual impact of what we do. So it's not just models and numbers and statistics, and it's actual people that you're dealing with, and creating value for your business, but also enhancing people's lives is something that I find very exciting. And yeah, that's why I'm in this space.
Sure. So the thing on that, if you think about the human in the system, and if you check your balance on, let's say, your bank, we figured now that over time it's become an habitual activity. Do you see that in telecommunications, people checking balance is habitual, or is it always driven by a cognition of some person making a decision and someday to say that I better go check it because I want to perform a subsequent action? Isn't it sometimes just behavioral habits that's driving that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a mixture, especially if you look at hybrid customers where they have a balance that gets loaded at the end of the month. You will see a spike on the last day of the month where they're checking, has that balance come in, and that's a habit that they formed over time. But sometimes it is driven by a specific need, or it's a pre-step to something that they want to do. And it's our job to figure out which is which, and because that obviously influences how you then want to treat that customer and the action that you want to take.
Yeah. So do you think that there's I mean, we can think about the interplay between, we often discuss it to say, if you wake up in the morning and you know that you're in a rush, or you wanting to check, let's take the example of checking a balance, or you want to go to your account to buy something, whatever it is, you don't kind of reason to say, oh, am I going to use the telephony channel, the USSD channel? Am I going to use the web channel or the human channel? That's not really how humans think about it. They think about preferences. So
yes.
there's a role that next best actions or preferences or channel preference and so on play in understanding how you're going to talk to the person. Because I think that the one thing that I think you figured out over time, and you explained this to me so many times, is that you've got these waves of how people engage. There's the mornings and the midday and the afternoon, and there's the weekend, and there's this ritual, and it's very almost ingrained in a person's decisioning that they've applied in many other parts of their lives. Was it?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I think it comes back to what I said in the beginning. If you could sit down and interview every customer on what is the ideal, like how should I interact with you, what do you find useful, those sorts of things, you would get those answers, but we can't do that. And the interactions is how they indirectly surface the answers to those questions to you. And it's up to us to use it. Like when it comes to personalization and recommendations and making recommendations that are useful to the customer, like I always go back to the questions of when and where. So where are the customers? What time is it? Those two are most of the time very closely related, and that has an impact on how you talk to them. If you're talking about an outbound situation, are you trying to talk to someone when it's 9 a.m. and they're in the middle of their school run or in traffic, and you're trying to compete for attention there? That's obviously not going to be very successful. Or are you trying to talk to them when they're having their morning coffee and they're scrolling through social media, and they're going to get onto a bus where they're going to listen to Spotify, but their data balance is low? So try and engage them with a Spotify bundle when they are in the mood of being talked to, and maximizing the likelihood that they take that up. So those questions of where and when and how are you speaking to them? So you mentioned channel. How you speak to them is very important. So they will tell you from their interactions and their behavior what channels they prefer and how they prefer to consume that info. And those are very powerful things that we can use in our systems to personalize how then we engage with them from that perspective. So yeah, lots of underlying the underlying information that you get from those interactions is actually how the customers are telling you what they want, because it's latent behavior, like you said. And yeah.
So here's a question then on the whole. I think the big challenge is that you got data in motion and you got or humans in motion and humans in stationary situations. So like you were saying, if somebody is busy doing sport or traveling, it's quite different than if they're in a stationary situation, and you might end up with a kind of like a geolocated view, or you understand some of those behaviors. And for the people that you've collected a lot of data for over time, it becomes quite easy, because it's never that easy, but it might become more consistent, because you'll see that, yes, this person is doing a certain ritualistic activity. But what about the people that you've never seen, that you've never spoken to? This whole challenge around the cold start problem. And how does that play out into this? Because I mean, that's the core to drive your learning initially, isn't it?
Yeah. I think that the cold start problem it's always an issue, and it's something that everyone that does or wants to do any sort of personalization will have to deal with at some point. And there's no perfect answer to it. I think it also depends very much on the context of the actual solution. If we're getting technical, what does the platform look like that's driving these recommendations? So we talked about real time. The alternative to that is batch. I think you get the standard mechanisms where if you don't know a lot about that specific person, you always dial it back to some level of aggregation, being, okay, I don't know that person, but there's always something that, especially in the real-time context. You might have a location, you might have even just the channel that they're interacting with. If they're interacting on the app and it's their very first time, you have like what do app users normally want to do when it's their first time that they're interacting with. And you use those things to see the interactions the best way you can, instead of just leaving it up to fate. See that the best way you can, and hopefully engage the customer so that they start building that profile over time.
Yeah. So here's the thing then, that you mentioned Spotify earlier, and I'm always intrigued by my own music listening patterns, because I sometimes find that recommendation systems and recommender models often converge too quickly. So what it means is that it figured out that I like this kind of music, and I listen to it once or twice, and then it thinks that, oh, this is it. This person has changed his mind, and he's now going to move on to this only going into the immediate future. There seems to be this inability for many of the generic recommenders to deal with this problem. And that means that beyond the cold start, once you've learned a little bit about the person, it's almost like you take the few learning points that you've discovered and you use that as the basis for all of what you're going to be doing next. When in actual fact, that's not really how humans think about it, isn't it?
That's a core problem of recommender systems in general, is it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So at some point, like you say, you might think, I have a stable understanding. Your recommender system influences now what your customers see and how they engage with you. But that then becomes the only way that, the only stuff that they see and the only way that they engage with you. So the recommender system is creating its own loop of, I think he likes or they like this, so I keep showing them this, and that's the only thing that your customer gets to respond on, which is a core problem for a lot of machine learning or AI applications, but especially for recommender systems. And there's various ways that people have tried to solve for this. I think one thing that we've always tried to do is have your recommendations mixed up with an unbiased new version of offering that is not informed by what you think is the best. So that
Like
you
an
always have...
anti-recommender or something.
Yeah, exactly. So like we use the term exploration for those kind of interactions. So we're exploring things that might not necessarily work out. They might, and most likely are, worse than the recommendations that we would have made if we just use the underlying models to inform it. But we're exploring different scenarios to make sure that we do get in that fresh perspective, because as people change, as they evolve, their tastes change, and you want a mechanism to learn from that. And if you just leave it to the recommender system, you might miss out on those learnings.
It's a bit like the novelty problem, isn't it? Because I think we all have different preferences around how much or new stuff or how many new things we can absorb in our lives. And it's just, you need to almost learn based on every situation, every interaction, every type of service or product that you're acquiring. So you need something that's far more dynamic in nature than just the classical way of saying, because if you think of the classical machine learning process, the theory is that it's really good at learning, but it's very bad at forgetfulness. So that means it's awesome at remembering everything, but it doesn't know what part of it you are supposed to forget in the next moment or the next phase that you're interacting with somebody.
Yeah, 100%. And depending on the technical approach you take, that problem becomes much worse, or you could try to account for that. But yeah, that's definitely it. You have this, what they call concept drift over time, where your models or your underlying AI solutions, the domain that you've built it on, tends to drift over time, and they're very bad at adapting to that if you don't specifically try and solve for that or build that into your solution. And again, that's kind of where the real time, when we talk about real time, where it becomes so powerful, where you in real time can try and adapt to those events, where in sort of like batch situations, where you're maybe updating your recommendations once a week or even once a day, it's too slow. And that interaction goes to waste, which is the cardinal rule that you don't want to break. You want to make every interaction with your customer useful and worth it.
So what's the heuristic for that? I mean, listen, this is a putting on the spot question. Because we debated this over time, and we've tried different models and different settings. And for me personally, I sit on the fence sometimes. I find that on one end, the easy answer is, let's just build a model, come up with an answer, and it's done. And the other end, make an assumption that the world's a changing world and humans are always going to want new things and just make it completely dynamic. I mean, what would a heuristic or heuristics or rules, whatever, what would they look like? Just on the spot here.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think to a certain extent that the exploration that I mentioned earlier, as much as it's an interesting way to make sure that your recommender systems stay fresh, it gives you a baseline as well to measure what your current solution is doing. You would hope that whatever recommender implementation you're using, compared to your exploration method where you're trying fresh new things that are not ideal, your recommender system should be better than that. So it gives you a consistent baseline to measure whatever approach you're taking against something that might be a little bit more random and a little bit more shocking to your
Exploring.
customers.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the heuristic, it's always it's a difficult question. It also depends on what you're trying to achieve. Like, are you trying to drive engagement? Are you trying to drive revenue? What sort of metric are you trying to maximize? Are you looking at short-term revenue or looking at long-term revenue? I think exploration specifically, it's trying to solve a specific problem, but it comes with a cost. So you're paying a price to be able to do that exploration that gives you your fresh perspective and that baseline to help make sure that your recommender system is performing at the level that you expect it to perform. But you're paying a cost because you're serving up not ideal recommendations knowingly. So it's always a balance, and you're paying a cost, but that cost has a payoff in the future. You're paying that little bit of cost upfront in today's terms, in terms of whatever it is, revenue or conversion, whatever metric that you care about. Paying that cost today to make sure that in a month or in a year's time, your recommendations are still valid. So it's trading off a little bit of a short-term cost for a long-term benefit. But that's the heuristic or the measure that I would default to, and then take it for what
you would try to think around your cost as your basis of your reasoning, because I always think of the cases that got to do with selling products that people only ever engage with once or twice in very long periods of time. Let's say they want to apply for fiber, or they're signing up for a 2-year contract versus somebody that is going to do a $10 bundle or something that's incredibly quick and fast, and they know that they do it weekly. The cost of doing it with it's going to take a longer cycle. I mean, the cost is enormous.
Yes. Yeah, 100%. And the way we used to do that is it gets built into your cost function. So the long-term benefit that you get, so something with a fiber or a contract line where the benefit is locked in for 2 years. So it's not or a year or whatever the contract term is. So getting that forward-looking view of what my benefit is a lot more deterministic in that case, which means the cost of exploring in that scenario is a lot higher, and then the cost would not outweigh the benefit. So you want to build that into your cost function so that you can make those trade-offs responsibly for the company, but also for the customer. You can imagine if someone's taking up a 1-year contract, and I know he wants a Samsung, but I'm going to offer him a Apple device just to see what he does. It's not a great customer experience either. It's super important that you build that into that costing function so you can measure the trade-offs responsibly.
So here's an interfacing question then, because I think that if you think about eligibilities and rules, like dealing with a cost function, the way you talked about it now, isn't it often that the people that are accountable and responsible for figuring out what the business's overall revenue is going to look like will set some of those rules almost? I mean, how much freedom do you think the data scientist, the machine learning engineer, the person that deploys it, how much freedom do you think they have or need actually working or not?
Yeah, it's a very I guess sensitive topic in the data science space, and in just not in the telco space even, but in every space. I think it's always a journey that you go on with your commercial owners or your product owners, and it's your responsibility as a data scientist to build that trust over time. So you might see the bias of, yes, let's start off with a bunch of rules around this system, because the commercial owners, if you look at it from their viewpoint, they often come with years of experience. They have some inherent domain expertise. They know what their customers want because they've been doing this for a long time. So they build in those rules as safeguards because they don't necessarily know what the recommender system is going to do. They don't understand it. They don't trust it yet. And it's your job as a data scientist to build that trust. You might start off like that, but then you have to prove your solution over time. You have to build that understanding with the commercial person.
That means just make money.
You have to bring them on the journey. You have to assure them they still have the relevant levers to pull if they want to influence certain mechanisms. And as you do that, you will see those guardrails get less and less over time, where you can hand off more to these more automated recommender systems to learn and do what they do best.
So you've traded across so many different industries, because you think about even from Booking and Vodafone and Woolworths and the like, you worked in many different industries. Do you think that there's a very big difference between, let's say, retail and telecommunications, the thinking of that responsibility? Because I think sometimes that if you deal with large volumes of customers at scale and you rely on a team that can really make sense of it, deploy it, is quite different than dealing with companies where it's more around the store and the retail experience. You know, do you find that's been challenging or exciting? I don't know.
It's definitely, I mean, they all come with a unique set of challenges. I think, like when you talk about the telco, especially the likes of Vodacom, the scale is so big that your cost of those interactions and maybe missing on them it's not as big. And with that, it brings a certain level of openness to experimentation and trying new things from a commercial perspective, because your cost is minimal. Whereas, say, in the retail space, and especially from a, like if I go specific to Woolworths, the one thing that people associate with Woolworths generally is quality, right?
South Africa, yeah.
In South Africa. So
other countries, it's not quite seen like
when you talk about trading off quality in any sense of the word, it's a difficult conversation to have. And it also comes back to that the scale of interactions. If someone is walking through the store to buy a new T-shirt and they maybe only do that once every 2 weeks, the cost of getting that interaction wrong is so much higher, which brings with it again then a certain level of risk averseness, and you just have to manage within that. That is the context that you operate in, and it's your job to figure out how to manage and still build that trust, even though it might take longer. So it's definitely I wouldn't even say industry, it's every company brings its own specific challenges and with it, which it keeps it interesting. And it's what I enjoy, is solving problems.
But do you think then that the problem that you're solving, maybe just to play a little bit back to what you said earlier around just the different approaches when you do the cold start versus continuous selling and the like across different industries? I mean, do you think that the skills are generically transferable? Do you think that the models are transferable? The technologies can be used? It's a bit like the debate that we had over time around the real role of real time, because once somebody gets their mind around it and they realize that, oh dear, this really gives me way more insights, even in a low rate of learning scenario, you shift your mindset quite a bit. But it seems that people get locked down a little bit over time, isn't it? It's like,
yeah, so I mean, to answer the first part of your question, I definitely think a lot of it is transferable, 80 to 90%, I would say. And that's when I look at hiring data scientists, industry-specific skills is always valuable because there is different nuances to it. But I'm more interested in the types of problems that they've solved instead of the industry that they've solved them in, because I think those skills definitely are transferable, and that way of thinking is. But then, yeah, like you get the specific challenges in certain corporates and in certain industries that are ingrained in there, which brings the nuance, that extra 15 or 20% that you need to cater for and tailor the solution to that.
Yeah. Listen, it's an anonymous attendee question before I've got a bunch of others, but let's just quickly, have you incorporated any specific methods or theories developed by professionals who specifically identify as interaction scientists or published in specific interaction science journals in your offer recommenders? It's maybe a loaded question.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what exactly your definition of that. I think we like me personally, I mean, I would say you're probably the expert in it. I think we have adopted methodologies that certainly overlap a lot, and the underlying, call it the conclusions that you draw from those methodologies are the same, although the implementation or what you call it might be slightly different. And I think it's also, it does, like, it reminds me a little bit of the whole data science industry. Like, data science is a term that sprung up like 10, 15 years ago. But before that, people were still doing things that we would classify as data science today. So there is a huge overlap, and similar to what you would call interaction science, why there might be shifts where interaction science is more focused on the human, or the methodology or the framework is slightly different. You will find there's a lot of overlap between your kind of more traditional recommender systems when you look at things like reinforcement learning, where the underlying paradigm, what it's trying to achieve, is the same, but it's called something else.
So here's something that, I mean, let's tag that onto the kind of reinforcement learning debate, because it seems that classically a lot of the ways in which people have implemented these systems, and especially if you use it from major providers like Amazon and the like, most of these models are designed around people who bought this, bought that. It's classical recommender approaches where it's got to do with associations and matrices and all the algorithms that go with that. It's a class of problem where it's a fairly known way in which people interact with you over time. Where in the reinforcement learning space, because your learning feedback is so tight, you have an entirely different perspective on the world. Maybe you just want to comment on that, because I think that's been a big shift in thinking, isn't it?
Yeah, it has, and even for me, like it is something that I still think a lot about. For me, it's a balance. There's pros and cons to both methods, and I guess that's why both methods are still in use. Like reinforcement learning in the context of real time and adapting quickly, that's where it shines and where the upsides are. The downsides with reinforcement learning for me is always, if you look at like where reinforcement learning is applied, generally it is in environments where the environment is well defined. So if you think of games like chess and those sorts of things where it excels, your environment is defined, you know what actions there is to take, what the reward is that you're trying to optimize for. In those sort of systems, it's easier to apply these sorts of algorithms. When you're talking about reinforcement learning in the recommendation space, when you're dealing with humans, like obviously we know humans are complex beings, it's very difficult to have a precise mathematical model of, if I take this action, this is the reward I'm going to observe. And that's the downside, right? Is your optimization and your reward function is a bit more volatile. So it makes applying those reinforcement learning techniques outside of the space where they usually shine a lot harder, but you get that real time feedback. So for me, it's always a trade-off. I won't say one is definitely better than the other. I think it depends on the environment. So also something with reinforcement learning, typically, although like there are ways around it now, but typically it shines in environments also where your feedback is instantaneous. So you don't want large delays. So in the case of signing up for a fiber line, someone might sign up today, but due to like the sign up process and having to check for coverage, and maybe they need to come install the line, you only see the actual line being installed, or the person paying the first debit order going off in 6 months' time. In those sorts of situations, reinforcement learning is maybe not the best application, because the action that you take, it takes so long to observe the effect of that action that there's no real upside to it. So I definitely say it depends on the context and the environment and the problem that you're trying to solve.
But don't you also think that it's got an interface with the algorithm that you're applying? Because if you had to apply like a Q-learning where the reward function creates a high degree of cost, but if you use a probabilistic model, and even if your feedback comes back and there's no feedback, the no feedback almost behaves like a static model. It just means that you don't have to deal with the complexity of the continuous learning cycle. I mean, do you think that there's something in there that could make,
yes,
think about the interactions?
Yeah. So definitely, I think, like I say, like there are some techniques that, like you are trying to overcome that, and you're maybe optimizing for something like lifetime value, which gives you over that longer window still feedback based on something that they're doing now. So you have proxies to infer that longer term effect. The thing that I always struggle with is, especially in a commercial setting, is you continuously have to test and feedback the impact of these techniques. So even if you're optimizing for something like lifetime value, observing lifetime value takes a while. So
Yeah.
practically to see, okay, I've taken this action theoretically, this is what the model is saying is going to happen, and there's a likelihood that it will happen, but it's not deterministic. So there's still a chance that it might not. So when you're experimenting with these things, the longer whatever metric it is, if it is something like lifetime value, the longer the window is on actually observing that metric, the more difficult it becomes to experiment, which is why I still bias towards more immediate feedback for applying those sorts of algorithms.
Yeah. So but I mean, that then goes back to an earlier conversation around static versus dynamic. So do you think then that if you look at the evolution of transformer architecture or the ability to keep attention, attention doesn't have to be in a classical transformer. So you could almost have an adversarial setup where you could experiment to decide based on the entropy or the evidence that you've collected about a particular product situation, channel, time of the day, or whatever the criteria are, and then dynamically select if you're going to use an exploit model versus a dynamic situation. Isn't that maybe one of the answers to drive experimentation? Because I think experimentation has been a core topic here, isn't it? To be able to do
Yeah. And maybe I'm also there when it comes to experimentation, which is a topic that's close to my heart, especially at Booking, focusing a lot of experimentation. Like I'm maybe also a bit more in the old school side of things, where dynamic experimentation and when you're moving away from something like an A/B test, where you have a predefined window, a predefined
Sorry, just to interrupt you. Maybe just give the listeners a view of what is old school versus new school then? What does it mean actually?
In my mind, old school is a lot more like how you would define a proper experiment in a almost like a A/B test, where at experiment runtime you have a set intervention, you have a set hypothesis up front that you're trying to test, where something like dynamic experimentation is you're changing it all the time. You are, as you're observing, you're modifying those constraints. So like your observation window and your intervention, you might change over time instead of having it be fixed for a certain amount of time. So in my mind, that's how I would separate the two. And both.
So where do you think I fit on that? Where do you think I fit on that spectrum?
Probably on the newer side, I'm guessing. Based
Yeah,
on
I'm more of
our other
multivariate. I'll defend the multivariate, multi-change condition because it's dynamic complexity. But you need both, isn't it? You need a world where
you need a world, and I think for me, it does boil down to what is it that you're trying to achieve, right? So if it is conversion rate and you want, or revenue, or you just want to maximize, whatever metric it is that you're interested in, there's certainly a case to be made for the newer side of things. If you are interested in understanding and not just maximizing the conversion rate, but understanding why did the conversion rate go up or down, you might tend towards the oldest school side of things. And in saying that, even then there's Bayesian techniques that you could try and get the best of both worlds. But for me, it's what is it that you're trying to achieve, and there's a place for both of them.
Yeah. But do you think that a company should, and especially in this case, our conversation is about telecommunication products and services and the like, do you think that they should have permanent experimentation in production where every single offer capability should have the cost of testing, novelty and alternatives? And because I think sometimes what happens with explore, exploit, even with the explores, it only explores within category, within where the focus is, and you often don't find the adjacencies, the things that are far removed from a person's common behaviors.
Yeah, no, I'm a huge proponent of exploration. I think not even just in the telco space, but I think it's something that technically you should be doing in all of your solutions. But even if we're just talking philosophically in terms of mindset, like I think that having a experimentation mindset is super powerful for any company, be it telco or retail or whatever. I think that is for me, like one of the best ways you build that understanding, and it gives you a nice framework within to work to optimize and continuously make things better. So I definitely think if you're not if you are not experimenting, there's definitely a huge opportunity that you might be missing.
Yeah. So what is the most successful product using all these techniques and approaches that you think you've taken to market? You don't have to tell us what it is, so the client will, but you just give us, what is the ratio of uplift that you thought, this cannot believe this? It's like this, give us the best case scenario, the way out there to say this was an enormous success.
Yeah, I think so. Sure. There's a lot. I think so. One of the best things that I've deployed, we saw like an uplift of close to 120%. So more than double of what the existing approach was as a baseline. And then I've also had the opposite, where the uplift is a lot less than you think. And that's always, if you think about that question, though, that's been a very tough question to answer in the business context, but even on the data science side of things, is what is good. So 120%, when someone hears
Now,
that,
what does good look like? What does it actually?
Yeah, 120% on average, probably if you ask people, is 120% uplift good? They'll probably say yes. But within that context of what you're trying to solve for, it might not be good. What does good even mean? How do you define good? And it's become especially difficult in the conversations on the other side, where the uplift is less than what you thought it was going to be, because there's a certain expectation that I was expecting 60 or 70 or 80%. It's arbitrary, but like, how do you set that baseline? What is good and what is reasonable? And that, even to this day, like, that's one of the most difficult questions to answer when you have these sorts of, exactly, when you have these sorts of conversations and implementations. It's an important thing to think about.
So how do you decide? Just give me, what would you audience what is a decision hook or a thinking hook or a idea that, because I think that we worked on so many cases on so many diverse places where you upfront, you reason through it, you do all the math, you look at samples, you run simulations, everything look like it's going to be okay, and then you deploy it and it's, oh no, this is not doing what it's supposed to do. And on the other end, you've had, oh no, I'm not sure this is going to perform, and then it goes.
Yeah, I think, and usually when it does that, when it performs better than you think, that's when you're more worried in that case.
Exactly. Why is it doing that?
Because it should not be doing this. So are we giving away stuff for free, or is there some sort of technical issue? No, but I think in terms of answering that question, it's not a very mathematical approach. I tend to ground it more in the commercial side of things, where I'm a huge fan of progress over perfection. So whether or not, so the baseline should be what is there today, and whatever you're doing, is it better than what we're doing today? If yes, I wouldn't be too worried, because you can always incrementally improve that. So that's typically how I tend to set that baseline, is whatever we're doing today, as long as we are doing better the next time, incrementally you will see that benefit over time. It might not be the best, and there might be a lot of room for improvement, but it's still better than what you did. Yes, that's an easy conversation to have. So that's sort of how I would ground the baseline, and it's an easy commercial conversation to have and to justify. Though you might have expected 120%, but you only got 20%. It's 20% more than you had yesterday. You can still improve on that.
I think it makes it complicated, and it's something that, I guess, if it's a service or as a platform, as a product, the complication is that you always have the dip before you have the lift. So that means that you almost have to remove the capex from the revenue benefit initially, because there's going to be a period when.
That's why your experiment design needs to be solid. So, like, for me, that's where it comes back to that A/B testing scenario, where there's that level of, like, customers always react a bit weird when you show them something new or try something new. There's a period of adaptation. Within that, there's other things like seasonality and all of that. So I would say you have to define that window up front and say, look, you should not be measuring it at that point. There will be a dip, but you should be measuring it over a longer period of time, where you allow for that to happen, and for this up front. Otherwise yeah, it's going to be difficult.
Yeah. So, and here's a technical question: what is the least favorable AI platform technology algorithm, or the best algorithm that you've experienced over time?
The worst algorithm
what is the go for, just for the data science people on the call?
I think so. I think again, it's difficult for me to give one like
No, I know. I'm just putting you on the spot.
This is worse. I think depending on your environment and what you're able to do, are you doing real time? Are you doing batch? You can still get away with your tree-based algorithms for a lot of things, even in the recommender space. We did something called contextual bandits, which is Microsoft wrote the paper on that, which is where you're basically tying the reinforcement learning paradigm and turning it into a supervised learning problem. So you're tying the two worlds together, and it boils down to essentially you're building something like a weighted random forest or XGBoost based on some reward that you observe. So you can still get away with that, get a lot of uplift with those sorts of algorithms. I'm always a huge proponent of what solves the problem with the least amount of effort. So it can be something, if it's something very simple, and oftentimes does not necessarily translate to even a machine learning algorithm. If we go back to the incremental benefit, you just want to be better than yesterday. It could be something very simple, like a rules-based thing. I wouldn't necessarily shoot it down. But if the problem requires something very advanced, that's the route that you have to take.
Yeah, listen, I'm a fan of contextual bandits. It's the core of a lot of stuff we do. And I think what's nice about the paper, especially in the Microsoft research team who published that, are all computational social scientists. You know that?
I didn't. Interesting.
Yeah, they part of the.
I might need to rethink using that then.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. You have to use it. Come on. Because I know that at Carnegie Mellon, at Case Center, and a few places, people have been discussing this for a while. And the core of what we've been doing at, I guess, at the ecosystem has been the fact that you'll be able to wire them together or decide how one sets the tone, the contextual variables for the next, and how you bring all of those pieces together. So listen, we're almost out of time. And any words or anything, comments that you maybe can make around your experience with the ecosystem real-time platform, or things that you've done with us? I mean, that's not the purpose of the session. We wanted to talk more broadly about the topic, but just if there's anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think we alluded to it in the very beginning of the call. Like we've been through some interesting times, those early morning calls where there was weird results or whatever. But I still, like I said, look back on that time fondly, because I think we did achieve something truly awesome with that platform. A lot of experimentation, and not every experiment was a hit, but I think in the long term, we achieved something truly exceptional there. And there's always room for improvement, but I think what we did with what was available at the time and with the platform, what it offered, we made a huge impact, massive. I won't go into the numbers now, but it was worthwhile. And I look back on those times of the most exciting times in my career. Yeah, it's been a great experience.
The purpose of today in the journey was really just to explain that understanding interactions with all the elements that go with that is a pretty broad field. We discussed it conceptually, and there are many algorithms and technologies and platforms and moving parts and people involved in making these things work. But at the end of the day, it's about the revenue, isn't it? Or about, you need to have some business anchor. And I think you've always been focused on that anyway, because every time we had to talk about even cases that we knew that work or didn't work, you had a very clear understanding. It doesn't matter how sexy, fancy, complicated, clever the tech is. It's got nothing to do with it. It's got to do with the impact.
Exactly. At the end of the day, that is what it's all about. And everything that you do has to tie back to that. What is the problem? What is the impact? And that's how you decide what the best solution is.
Excellent. Thanks. Estian, was great having you on our series.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for the